Good afternoon, everyone. Almost back from lunch. My name is Stacy Wolf. I'm a research nurse practitioner in the Pediatric Stem Cell and Gene Therapy Clinical Trials Program at Stanford and Lucille Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. And my talk today is going to be on differentiating between study and standard of care patients. Just a brief summary of objectives. We're going to talk briefly about some of the basic differences between standard clinical research and how some research protocols in their design may utilize standard of care as part of the study design. And we'll talk briefly about some billing implications related to this. So we've used standard of care a lot as a term, and I've heard it used in several of the presentations today, and we use it a lot in the medical context, but really standard of care is a legal definition. And it's really as it relates to medical malpractice. And there's not a standardized definition of standard of care because it varies state by state. But typically, there are certain elements that we see commonly used in some of the definitions. And I included the one that I really liked the best from an editorial in an ASH publication and from 2018 that notes standard of care is the level and type of care that a reasonably competent and skilled healthcare professional with a similar background and in the same medical community would have provided under the circumstances. And this kind of encompasses a lot of what is typically understood to be a standard of care. There's a lot of different terminology that can be used in exchange as usual care, treatment as usual, regular treatment, existing practice as such. But really the importance for clinicians is in understanding the concept of standard of care is because failure to meet what is considered an acceptable standard of care in that practice community can be considered negligence on some level. And so that can have potential financial and legal implications, as many of us know. And defining standard of care, it's really can be influenced by a number of different factors depending on where you are and where you practice. But certainly certain federal and state laws or regulations can have an impact on what might be considered standard of care. Regulations from like our state licensing boards can also have an impact. You can have authoritative clinical guidelines. So if you have an expert panel that's convened in order to publish what may be the best practice for a certain condition. Professional organizations can often release their policies and guidelines as recommended practice. You have evidence-based research articles, certain accreditation standards. Many of us are familiar with FACT, right? So there are certain guidelines that FACT requires their transplant centers to perform as part of their standard of care for caring for cellular therapy and transplant patients. And then institutions can have their own kind of policies and standard operating procedures that may define within a department or a specialty what is going to be considered standard of practice for that institution. And there can be variability from institution to institution, amongst regions, amongst kind of geographic regions as well. It can be different based on, things such as your institutional formularies may help determine what's your first line standard of care for certain conditions. Individual practices and providers may just have their own standard of care based on previous experience or preferences. Patients their preferences may also influence what the standard of care may be for them. What an insurance will cover will also have an impact, and whether or not certain institutions or areas have access to certain therapies. So those are all going to play into kind of what is a standard of care within a certain area or region. And it's really important to understand that standard of care is something that's not static, right? It's constantly changing and evolving as evidence improves or as practices change with time. So I've included here just a few examples of organizations that offer clinical practice guidelines, professional organizations. So the National Comprehensive Cancer Network in Oncology has over 60 clinical practice guidelines available for both pediatric and adult types of cancer. The American Society of Hematology has 9 clinical practice guidelines for various hematologic conditions. And the Children's Oncology Group is a pediatric consortium under the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, that has they coordinate a lot of clinical studies in pediatric oncology. That's my background, is in pediatric oncology. And kind of as those studies evolve and as they get evidence and assess the best quality of care as a result of many of these studies, that kind of becomes the next best standard of care for different pediatric malignancies. So these are just some examples of some professional clinical practice guidelines that are available that could potentially influence that standard of care. Now, shifting a little to research, research is different, right? Because research sets out to answer a specific scientific question. And this is with the goal of actually advancing the overall knowledge that we have that we hope that will contribute to improvements in patient care. Research is standardized, right? I think most of them in this room are familiar with research protocols that can range from 60 to like 300 pages. And it's not customizable for individual patients. You have to follow the protocol as it's written for each patient. There's a defined patient population that's usually included, and they have to meet strict inclusion and exclusion criteria in order to be eligible to participate in a research study. There can sometimes be protocol specified restrictions on clinical care, right? Because they'll want to make sure that the data being collected isn't influenced by a number of different variables. So sometimes there are restrictions on clinical tests or other procedures or medications that patients enrolled on studies may not want them to be partaking in. Clinical research can involve randomization, right? So patients can be randomized into various treatment arms. You can have an experimental versus a control group. You may have an intervention versus a standard of care group. You can sometimes see masked assignment of treatment. So patients may be blinded to what intervention they're receiving. So it's single blinding, or the research team, the investigator, as well as the patient may be blinded. So double blinding of that study. And some patients enrolled on clinical trials are not going to receive any intervention at all. They may be on a placebo arm. And I think when entering into a clinical research study, the important thing to notice is that there's really no guarantee to the participant that they're going to receive a benefit from it being enrolled on a clinical study. And there may be varying levels of risks of harm. And so research is really those risks for harm are justified based on the knowledge that there should be some gain, something to expected to be gained from participating in a research study, whether it's the research information itself, not particularly something that's going to be gained for the patient. But because there are some unknown risks of participating in research, as well as potentially more than minimal risks, there are a number of different ethical frameworks and regulations that have been developed over the years to really try to protect the participants who are involved in clinical research. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But really, because of this, pretty much all research that involves human subjects are going to be overseen by an institutional review board, an IRB, because really these IRBs, their main purpose is to really ensure the protection of the rights and the welfare of human research participants. And for clinical care, you won't have something equivalent to an IRB. So listed here are just a number of, not a comprehensive list, but some of the different ethical frameworks and regulations that have been developed over the years. And really, I think many of you have seen some of these in some of your previous studies. But really, these evolved because of a number of abuses that have occurred over many years and decades within the scientific research involving human subjects, both in the United States and around the world. And so these really have always evolved in response to negative things that have happened. And it's really not within the scope of this presentation to go over all of these, but and this again is not a comprehensive list, but it's really just to show you that there are a number of things that really influence how research can be conducted, especially in this country. So it's a pretty highly regulated field. This slide just is a kind of a summary slide of a few of the things that I've mentioned already, just in comparing what we see with standard of care and what we typically see with research. So standard of care involves the diagnosis, the prevention, the treatment and care of patients with the goal of really benefiting the health of that individual. It's usually evidence-based, and it's guided by what the standard practice and experiences at that time. And the risks of the interventions are really justified based on the prospect of a therapeutic benefit for that individual. Standard of care can also be thought of as accepted clinical practice. And we really think that these interventions are going to have a reasonable likelihood of success for these patients. And there is flexibility in standard of care, right? In the decision-making that goes into it. So if something doesn't work or there's a side effect, you change the plan of care to make sure that you're actually working to benefit, hopefully, and to treat the underlying condition. Research, however, the aim is really to generate knowledge, right? It starts with that scientific question. And it's not always designed to meet the needs of the individual patient. It's really looking at the more collective and common good, right? With the goal of potentially benefiting patients or communities or groups in the future, but not necessarily in the present. And there is some risk that may be justified, but again, it has to be tightly overseen to make sure that we're not exposing these patients to undue risk and harm. And again, the individual participant may or may not receive any benefit for participation in a clinical research study. And I think what's important is that because of that, this is also a different conversation, but really the importance of informed consent, right? When you're consenting and enrolling patients on clinical research, to make sure that they understand that they may not actually be receiving a benefit from participating in this. And it's also important to know that research, the ultimate goal is like, once something hopefully has been proven to be effective, that may then become standard of care after enough evidence has been gathered to prove that that may be so. In research also, you have to very closely follow the what's spelled out in the protocol. Like I said, these are the must be done. You have to follow the protocol defined time points and evaluations that need to happen. So sometimes standard of care can also be incorporated into research studies in a few different ways. Sometimes it can be used as a comparative arm in the design of the research study. So you may be looking at a new intervention or investigational agent, and you're comparing that to standard of care therapies to see what is the benefit, is there a benefit, and then what are the risks. Standard of care can also be used to compare it to like a variation in the current standard of care. So you may see a different dosing schedule. You may have a higher or lower dose than what may be seen as standard of care. You may be altering the frequency or the intensity of treatment. And I've got a few examples to show you. But what's really important is to understand when you're looking at a protocol, kind of what are the protocol specific requirements, those things that must be done at the time point specified in the study, versus what is the standard or clinical care. And that is often per the provider discretion and does not have the same kind of requirements needed. There may be some overlap, right? There may be time points when we're drawing things based on what the studies require, but we would also be doing them as standard of care. And what's important is really to understand that this can also have implications for billing. I'll talk briefly about this at the last slide, because that's a very complicated topic as well. But understanding what's directed by the study to be done at time points versus what's being done as standard of care. And how do we bill for those? So I created a couple just pretend diagrams of different design schemas. They're kind of loosely based on some of the children's oncology group studies I worked on many years ago, because I really grew up on COG studies in my nursing career. So this is one that's kind of a generic one for pediatric acute lymphoblastic lymphoma. And what you'd see. So for these patients, all patients are enrolled. They all undergo, pointer's not working. They all undergo induction therapy. And at the end of induction therapy, their disease status is assessed. And in this schema, they're either categorized as standard risk or high risk based on certain risk factors and features that are seen at the end of the induction therapy. And in this study, you can see each of the cohorts are randomized into one of two arms. And each has a standard of care arm, and each has an intervention arm. And in this one, I just added an investigational agent. And so here you're seeing standard of care is really utilized as the best treatment that we know up to date for pediatric ALL. And then the question is, well, if we add an investigational agent to the standard of care, will that actually improve outcomes without improving toxicities for this patient group? So this is one example of how standard of care can be used in a clinical trial design. And separately, also kind of a pediatric ALL design, this one has standard of care built into it as well, and kind of different randomization built into it. So again, patients receive induction therapy, their disease status is assessed at the end of induction, and they're either categorized as average risk or low risk. There are a lot of risk categorization in pediatric ALL. And this one, the average risk arm, all patients receive standard of care until they get to the point of maintenance therapy, at which time they're randomized, and they will either receive arm A, which is the standard of care. They'll get vincristine and dexamethasone every 4 weeks, or arm B, where they're still getting vincristine and dexamethasone, but instead of every 4 weeks, they're getting it every 12 weeks. So there's one example where we're not adding a new investigational agent. We're just modifying the existing standard of care practice to see if, well, maybe these patients that have these average risk or good risk factors maybe can get by with getting less chemotherapy, but getting less toxicity and having the same outcomes. And similarly, on the low risk arm, these patients are actually, say they're randomized up front, and they're looking at either standard of care therapy, the LRC arm, or consolidation or therapy with kind of less therapy over time. So this is just another example of how this can be built and standard of care can be utilized in research design. And I will say I did actually add, there's 2 extra boxes here that should have been deleted. I duplicated it. So I just noticed that after the slides were published. And the third example is really, this one, I think some of you who've worked on gene therapy studies might be familiar with. This is a single arm kind of generic schema for patients undergoing gene therapy product for sickle cell. So this one really, everybody on this single study arm is going to get the investigational product. And there is no really standard of care arm in this design. But in this instance, a standard of care would be really understood to be the regular clinical care for a patient with sickle cell. So whether they're getting transfusion therapy or they're on I forget some of the names of the newer medication, crizanlizumab, I think, that would, or a standard allogeneic transplant from, say, a matched sibling donor, like that would be the standard of care. This study would just, everybody is on an investigational arm. So this is all research based. And I've also just created a very generic schedule of assessments or schedule of activities. These are seen in almost all clinical research studies, especially in cellular therapies. And these really define the study-related time points when things must be done, right? So it lists the assessments that need to be done and the time points that they need to be done, if there are any windows with that. So even if some of these are overlapping with standard of care time points, as they just have to be done at these time points based on research. And then any additional standard of care stuff at those time points are considered standard of. So we'll talk a little bit, I think, in this slide about the importance of billing. So when I was a clinical nurse and nurse practitioner for many years, this was something completely outside of my scope and my understanding. But as I've worked a little bit more on the clinical side with some of the research patients, and then now that on the research side, I'm learning a little bit more about the billing process, and it's a very complicated process. So one slide is obviously not going to cover hardly any of it. But the important thing to understand, I think, is that when a research study is presented to an institution, a lot of the stuff happens on the back end. So the frontline clinical staff really don't have much involvement in this. But usually when the studies are onboarded, there's something like called a study budgeting and billing workbook that's often done. And up front, it's determined what is going to be what is research only, what is going to be billable to the research study, and what is going to be billable to insurance. And that's determined up front. And that is important because as the patients go through their treatment process, those first of all have to be billed correctly, which is again done on the back end, but also understanding things in it that are not on the study are always going to be billed to insurance, unless for some reason you have a clinical study where the research budget is paying for everything, which does happen. And so for those things that are not going to be billed to the insurance, for those things that are not going to be billed to the study, the same process is going to have to happen, right? Prior authorization and any out-of-pocket costs that the patients would normally be paying are still going to have to be paid by that patient. And so this gets confusing a little bit for some families, and my work in pediatrics, I say families, but for patients and families, because it's confusing when some things are billed to the research study, and then they get a bill and they're like, I don't understand. I'm on a research study. Why am I getting a bill for this? So having these conversations with patients and families up front is really important, because they're still going to be responsible for the out-of-pocket cost for the normal expenses, as even if they're enrolled on a clinical study. But also important, there are certain things that are never going to be billed to insurance for patients that are on research studies. So anything that is done specifically for data and analysis that's not really used to guide clinical care is always going to be billed to the research study when there are research labs, and any investigational product or items related to the administration of that investigational product will not be billed to insurance. Those will be billed to the study budget. I've included the Medicare Medicaid information because many years ago, many insurance companies would actually not cover the cost of care for patients that were enrolled on clinical trials because they considered it experimental. And a number of years ago, Medicare came out with guidelines saying that any Medicare patient that was enrolled in a qualifying clinical trial, the cost of their routine care would also be covered by Medicare. And then Medicaid more recently came out with guidance, because Medicaid is, even though it's funded by the federal government, partly it's run by the states. And so there were different guidelines amongst states. But I think in 2022, Medicaid came out with guidelines saying that any Medicaid patient also that is enrolled on a qualifying clinical trial, that Medicaid has to cover that. And the Affordable Care Act also had a provision in which required now private insurers as well to cover the routine cost of care for patients enrolled on clinical studies. So this is important too, because it's very helpful. Now, when a patient is enrolled, we fill out, we have a form at our institution, this Medicaid attestation form we fill out on all patients enrolled on clinical trials. And we put that in their note to make sure that, so that we are able to build insurance for patients enrolled in clinical studies. So that's a long conversation. This is the information I am least comfortable with, because this is the newest to me as well, but it's actually really important. And understanding that really billing compliance is a really important part of what's done, usually by the research team. And knowing that when things aren't billed correctly, that can have implications for the institution, especially if things are being billed inappropriately or incorrectly to the insurance that should not be billed, or if they're being duplicate billed. It can run afoul of perhaps some state and federal regulations, and that can have some financial implications for institutions. So on that note, I will close. So thank you.